Right, thank you very much for once again coming back in so promptly. We are now in the final stretches, and I am very proud to present Phil Cornelius to take you through a demo, and then Phil is going to answer some of the questions with a panel of experts that you've been storing up all day, perhaps some of the questions which we haven't already answered, which you've already asked. We'll see if we can get some answers for those as well. So, over to you, Phil. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So a little intro about me. I'm one of the specialists here covering the EMEA region. It's in pre-sale, so we go in and talk architecture to organizations, help them understand how they can use Ansible within their business. My background's mainly in application development. Can I have a show of hands? Who here is from sort of software development background on the application development side? And I presume the rest are operations and platforms. And maybe we got networking in here as well. So I'll be covering sort of use cases from both of those sides. But my background predominantly is in application development, methods and tools, and that kind of thing. So prior to Red Hat, I worked in financial services for about 6 years. So I'm used to doing this in a regulatory environment. And really, that's what I want to try and show to you today. So you would have done or would have heard some talks talking about Ansible. And Ansible is about automating those things that you're manually doing today that gives you immediate value, and also builds up a description of the sort of heritage systems that you have today. And what Tower is a runtime platform for Ansible. It doesn't do anything more in terms of automation, but it allows you to integrate your Ansible execution within your existing processes. So whether that's release management, software development, or just change management, any of those processes that you already have today in your existing infrastructure, what Tower will do is let you, or allow you, via an API, call and execute those things that you were currently doing manually. So you need it when you're on that path to production and when you really want to make Ansible enterprise grade. If you're using Ansible and you're hacking about in development, you basically have lost the log files. You need to know the private keys to access the servers. You need to know all the secrets. And what Tower will do is allow you to keep those things secret, but still allow people with a one-click to be able to perform those tasks that you have automated within a playbook. This session is going to be entirely demo, so this is the last slide that you'll see, apart from the Q&A one we have at the end. And what I'm showing you here is the demo environment that I've got set up here on my Mac. So all of this is running on my Mac, and I'm going to take you through a couple of use cases. One of the use cases will be provisioning in Amazon, so I'll go provision some Windows machines to show you that we can also work with Windows. You saw the Windows talk earlier. But I'm actually going to go provision some Windows machines. So they don't exist right now. We're going to go and create those. And then we're going to go and install some stuff on those machines so you'll see them running. And then I'm going to show you how to integrate Tower into like a tool chain. So continuous deployment. We'll go and provision some things onto a machine and deploy some software. And then I'll show you how to move that on into sort of release management. So how can we give that capability to the release manager so they can push things to production? And hopefully by the end of this, you'll get a sort of sense of, oh, right, I understand how Ansible is going to help me automate my manual things, but now I understand how I can integrate that into my existing processes. So really important to understand. You do not need to change the way that you work within your organization today to use Ansible. Your existing processes are fine. It's just they probably have some manual steps that are slowing things down. And this will allow you to automate those manual steps to speed things up. And once you've got that perfect description, you are then in a position to be able to sort of transform to the new places that you want to go to. So that's the general idea. So in this lab environment, I've got a little Git lab, which is a behind the firewalls Git repository. I've got an artifactory, which is a binary artifact repository. The alternative is Nexus. So this is a general content repository. You need those two things to pretty much be able to build anything. Your source control system has the instructions for how to build stuff. Your binary artifact has the raw materials for how you build things. So whether that's operating system images or the libraries that you need in order to sort of build your software. So those two things are quite important. TeamCity is just a continuous integration server like Jenkins or Bamboo. And the reason I've put these in here is I've built a little mini tool chain that might represent your tool chain. So most organizations will have already centralized their software development process. And what Ansible is about is treating your infrastructure as code and then using that sort of tool chain process to give you governance and control around your environment management. I've got Ansible Tower that's sat in the middle that's going to be doing the use cases and the orchestration. And then I've got a few virtual machines sat here at the bottom. One I'm going to treat like a development box. The other one I'm going to treat as a production server. And then I'm going to do all this from a Windows VM, because that's what most people's corporate environments like, so it'll be a bit more familiar to you. So the next thing I'm going to go into is that Windows VM. So we mentioned earlier Ansible Galaxy. That whole development environment, that whole virtual environment that I showed you, I built that with roles from Galaxy. So roles that were contributed by the community that's up there on GitHub. And so when I came to set this demo up, I came along to Galaxy, galaxy.ansible.com, and I searched for tools that I was very familiar with from my previous work. And I came across the Artifactory one. I was looking for the Artifactory one, and I was able to find the one that had been downloaded the most. And I was able to click through and actually see all of the source, the Ansible source code that would go and install Artifactory for me. And so I was able to include that in a playbook, and I'll show you what that playbook looks like in a moment. And all the other tools I was able to include from Galaxy roles as well. And so it's a great place to start if you want to get a leg up. If you didn't understand earlier from what a role is, it's a self-contained piece of automation laid out in a conventional way that you can include in your playbook just with one line. And so if I show you, I'm just going to go to my internal GitLab, and we'll have a look at the playbook that I use to set up this development environment. So I'm going to go to my plays and have a little look at this. I'll zoom this in because it's a little bit small. So notice here the host. I've got a little bit of lag on my trackpad. The host is toolchain, and this is the toolchain machine that it's configuring. And so the first role I've got here is the Oracle Java role. Now, Oracle, or installing Java, is one of those manual steps that most organizations have to do. They usually have a team that manages that separately, and then that team will get blocked because there will be a particular application development group who is not yet ready to take that version of Java, or they don't want that risk of that update. To install Java, you've got to go to Oracle's website. You have to tick the right file. You tick the end user license agreement, you download the file, you upload it to a server, and you install it. This role does all of that for you. So it manages the cookie, goes to the website, goes and gets the file, and installs it. So you've automated a very typical manual task. It's that kind of pragmatic manual task that Ansible is absolutely brilliant at. The next one here, certificate management. Generally in development, you'll be managing self-signed certificates. You don't want to bother with proper CA-signed certs in development. Obviously, you will have that set up in production. But typically, that means you need to put those CA certs into your key store so you don't get SSL or handshake errors along the way. Somebody's written a role. Again, this is all out in the community. And I'm able to override variables in that role. So I point to an endpoint and a port, and it will connect to that endpoint, get the PEM, and inject it into a key store, all defined by these variables underneath the role. I won't linger on this too much, but you can see here, here's the Artifactory one. So that will go and install Artifactory on a database that I've picked with technical accounts that I've picked. I've got one that will install Team City, and the one I love the most is Geerling Guy's GitLab. Once I'd set this tool chain up, I realized I needed a place or repository to store my playbooks, and I was going to just sort of serve it up via Nginx. But actually, Jeff Geerling, who's a prolific writer of roles, and he's written books as well on Ansible, had written the GitLab role. So I cut and paste this from the website, put in my LDAP credentials. This is all private, so it doesn't matter that I've got this in clear text, but I could have vaulted it. And then I reran this playbook. So obviously, Artifactory's already installed, Team City's already installed. It just went then, did the steps to install GitLab, and it hooked it into my LDAP directory within about 20 minutes. And so I had GitLab that is now hosting this file up within 20 minutes as part of this tool chain. So this play has managed to integrate that tool chain, and that's what I'll be using as part of the demo. So I've got GitLab, which is this tool, and behind the firewall's Git repository, Artifactory, which is a general artifact repository. So again, those two tools that you absolutely need. Team City, which is your equivalent to Bamboo. It's a continuous integration server. And these are the tools that I'll show you as we go through the use cases. So I'm just going to take a little step backwards to talk about Tower and how Ansible fits with Tower. So Tower is, as I said, a runtime platform. It offers you nothing more in terms of your automation. So everything that you want to automate, everything you want to provision, everything you want to configure is all there in the modules that you get with the Ansible core product, or what we call Red Hat Ansible Engine. What Tower provides is a runtime environment around that, with some protection. So there's things like bubble wrap, which will stop your playbooks being able to execute things on the Tower server outside of a certain jail. And also provides you the means with which to pass secrets to your Ansible execution without you needing to know what those secrets are. So you really need this on your path to production. Some of the questions I get are, well, can't I do that with Jenkins? Jenkins is a development tool. And it doesn't have these capabilities of managing secrets and managing the sort of workflows and security you need around Ansible execution. Those are the things you definitely need when you're operationalizing your Ansible. And so Tower really is that tool you need on the path to production. What I'm showing you is from the documentation, and this is the high-level entity diagram of the Tower product. So Tower is written on Django, which is a Python framework a bit like Rails or Grails. And in particular, it uses the Django REST framework. So we're REST first. Absolutely everything we write the REST endpoint for. And then we provide the Angular UI behind that. And then we provide modules for accessing Tower via the REST API with the Tower module or the Tower CLI. The reason I'm showing you this is because it introduced a couple of concepts that are quite unique to Tower. And so if you've not seen Tower before, but you know Ansible, it's good to understand where those lines are. So the first thing, inventories, groups, and hosts. In Tower, Tower takes away, it manages the inventory for you, but the concept is exactly the same as the Ansible inventory concept. So if you have group vars and host vars sat next to your playbook, as long as they're at the playbook level, it will pick those variables up if you've defined group vars. So that mechanism is exactly the same in Tower as it is with Ansible Core. All that's happening underneath is that Ansible is being run in a virtual environment, again with some protection, what we call bubble wrap around the outside. The playbooks over here, they are absolutely one and the same as the Ansible playbooks you run, except now your hosts will generally always have all next to them because Tower takes over which hosts you limit the execution to. So that's the only sort of change you need to make to your playbooks. You have them, they're all in the hosts. And then all of the other objects here are to do with the features that Tower give you. So organizations, teams, and users, this is where the role-space access control comes from. Organizations is like a Chinese wall. So you're able to delegate responsibility to separate admins. But what I would say is you're in the business of automation. And so the creation of objects in Tower should also be automated. You already have existing processes like RFC. You already have existing toolchain processes. So you're already creating objects that represent roles within your organization, not Ansible roles, but job roles. And so, make use of that. And then when you create a project or you create a team in another tool, like your toolchain, then you can create those objects in Tower as well, and it just becomes an extension of that toolchain. These organizations and teams, they can be mapped to LDAP groups, and that's what I've done here in this lab environment. I've got a little open LDAP server running with a few groups defined. And what I want to show you is from the context of different users in different groups, we can provide that power of execution without giving away the keys to the kingdom. So we can provide a secure, operational platform with which to run Ansible. So the other important concept here is credentials. You are able to store credentials in Tower. They are encrypted in the database. There's no API access to those credentials, so it's different to HashiCorp Vault or CyberArk. Those become available at playbook execution time. So I'm able to provide, and I will show you this in the demo, I'm able to provide the keys to Amazon to a team that's mapped to an LDAP group, and just by virtue of being in that LDAP group, I'm able to provision machines without knowing what those secrets are. So you can have your engineering team write the playbook that describes how to do the provisioning, and then you can delegate that responsibility to an operations team or a first-level team that can just click and provision machines, or you can make it self-service for the developers. If they want a sandbox environment, they can just click and up it comes. And anything you can code in a playbook, you could make available self-service within Tower. The other important thing, this is probably the thing that I really put this diagram up for, is we have this concept of a job template, and that's best described as what I otherwise would have typed at the command line. So if you're doing command line Ansible, you need to pass in private keys, you need to pass in all sorts of various options, inventory, limits, that kind of stuff. You know, how do I code that up into a UI to make it one click? The job template captures all of that for you. And it also allows us to do a whole bunch of other things too. We're now able to pick the version of Ansible that you want to run the playbook as. We're also now able to job shard across inventory. So prior to version 3.4, 3.4.1 was released last week, which is the version I'm running here. Prior to that, if you ran a job against a lot of servers, it would all have to run on one node, whereas a new feature we have in 3.4 is you can shard the inventory. So you can take a job, you can split it into, say, do it every 100, and it will spread that job across however many nodes you've got in a Tower cluster, and it'll execute them all and bring all the results back together. So that's a really powerful feature you have of Tower. Anyway, mindful of time, I'll move on to the actual demo. So I've got a few LDAP groups defined. That's just what I'm showing you here. This is just a front end to open LDAP. Out of the box, by default, we'll connect to Active Directory, but I've made some modifications in the config in order to connect to Open LDAP. But I've got a few groups defined, and it's important. When I said you already have existing processes, you already have organizations and group structures, so make use of those. And so I'm giving an example of the place that I worked before. We had a self-service provisioning of toolchain, and we had groups defined per application. And so I've kind of modeled that here. Here I've got an application called FiliApp, and then I've defined a few groups associated with that to do with whether you're just a viewer, whether you're a committer or contributor, whether you're a release manager, or whether you're an admin of the project. And so we'll be doing something with the FiliApp application a little bit later. And I've also defined a cloud operations group where I'm going to have somebody go provision some machines. So in the cloud operations group, I've got a guy called Mario. Mario's going to go provision those Windows machines. And then I'm going to do things from the context of the FiliApp application. One as me, the developer. So I'll show you how we interact with the REST API in order to automatically deploy my config and my application to my server. And then I'll also show you how we can delegate the deployment into production to my release manager. I'm going to skip over testing, just from the purposes of demo, but testing obviously is very important, so don't skip over that for real. I've also got my Tower locked down to Tower admins and Tower users. If I'm in the Tower admin group, then I have got access to all of the objects within Tower. So I'm just going to log into Tower now as a guy called Simon. Simon is in the Tower administrators group, and so now you can see the Tower dashboard. So again, I reiterate, Ansible is about automating those manual tasks that are currently slowing down your processes, your existing process, not some magical new way of working. It's just installing Java, managing certificates, setting up technical accounts. It's those sorts of things that are slowing down your processes. Automate those with Ansible, and then Tower will provide the REST API for you to integrate those into your existing workflows. So don't change your workflows, not yet. Once you've automated that, you've sped everything up, then you're in a position to transform some new place. So here we've got a dashboard. It's showing me how many hosts are currently being managed, how many different inventories I've got, how many different projects that I've got. Projects I didn't mention, they are one-to-one mappings with a Git branch or tag. So that's where I get my playbooks from. That's what a project is. If I look at the job templates, this is where all of my playbooks are defined. We also have the concept of a playbook workflow. What the workflow is so in a perfect world, you would describe your infrastructure with some roles in one playbook. And so you'd have control over everything, the network, the storage, the server provisioning, the application deployment. You know, that's the DevOps way. But the reality is most organizations still are functionally separate. They still have a separate operations group who are going to be writing the provisioning playbooks. They have a separate security group and write the security playbooks. And a workflow is a way of bringing those together. So it's only really there from an organization point of view. The really holy grail is describing everything with roles and playbooks. So I've got a workflow here. If I can find it. I've got a little bit of slowdown on the scrolling. But I've got a workflow here which is going to be provisioning some Windows machines. It's a very simple workflow. I just sort of visualize it on the screen. But basically it's going to do some provisioning. It's then going to synchronize the inventory, and then it's going to go configure those machines. I'll walk you through the playbook, but I'll do it all in one playbook, which is where you would like to get to. But when I execute it, I'll show you it from the context of a workflow. So let me just close this down. And so what I'm going to do is, the other thing I've got defined here is this survey. And what the survey is, so in Ansible, everything kind of hinges around variables. Variables define your config, and they live in 3 places. One place is the inventory. So if you've got an inventory source like vCenter or Amazon, you can add metadata, and all that information will come in. That's one source of information within Ansible. The other source is the playbook itself, which typically is used in sort of application deployment. So you would define variables in your playbook, and the third place are the facts that you get from the server. Now, those 3 places are all you need to define an orchestration of several servers and several solutions. You do not need a separate place to store config. And invariably, those things can all end up in your source control system. So what I'm showing you here in the survey is that I'm able to override a variable in my playbook by asking a question of the user. And so I'm able to put constraints around what values that variable can take. And the variable underneath is nothing special. It's an Ansible variable. It can be an inventory variable, it can be a playbook variable, but I can put constraints and bounds around that. So you can see how I can now offer a sandbox provisioning service to my users and make sure they don't put in 1 million servers to Amazon. You know, they're restricted by 10 or however many I define in here. But any kind of variable that you want to constrain or in order to make your playbooks one-click executable, you can do that in the survey. So let me just log out. Well, what I'll do first, I'll just check that I can connect to Amazon. So I'm going to go to my Amazon inventory, and I'm going to synchronize it. I provisioned a machine just before this talk to make sure I could, and I could then, so I hope that I can now. I'm just going to synchronize this. There's another little feature I want to show you. This is going to go up to Amazon. All it's doing is running the Amazon dynamic inventory script, as said, underneath. Well, that happened very quickly. You'll see below a little bit of toast has popped up. I've got this integrated into a mail server that's running internally as well. You can integrate this with HipChat, although you probably don't want to do that. I think it's a dead project now. Slack, Twilio, PagerDuty. There's a whole bunch of messaging services that you can connect Amazon to. Sorry, Amazon, what am I talking about? Tower, you can connect Tower to and get notifications about things that have changed, whether that's an inventory sync or a playbook run. And you get a little bit of JSON in the message. If I click on the message, you get a little bit of JSON in here and a hook into the REST API. And so one way of integrating with Tower, again, is via messaging. The other is via the REST API. So I've successfully synchronized the inventory. If we go back to my dashboard, okay, I've got 13 hosts. I had 13 before. We'll go provision some more. We'll see that number go up. So I'm just going to log out as Simon, and I'm going to log in as Mario. So Mario is in the Cloud Operations group, and that is mapped to the Cloud Operations team in Tower. There's a credential, which is my Amazon key, that is associated with that team. Mario will not and will never know what that secret is, and yet he is still able to provision machines. So I'm just going to go to the workflow for Mario, so he can only see that one workflow. That's how we've got the role-based access control set up. So now I connect. It's telling me that survey, how many instances do you want? Let's say we want 5, and hit next. You'll see here, this is the variable it's overriding. This is the value that we're overriding it with. And then if I launch this, now Mario is just in the team that's doing the provisioning, so when we click through, he has no access to the actual details on this job. So I will log back in as Simon, and then we can see kind of what's going on. And then I'll walk through the playbook, and you'll be able to see what that playbook's actually doing, so you can see what a provisioning playbook looks like. It's a demo playbook. It's not hardcore production grade, Ansible. But hopefully you'll get an idea of the simplicity of it. So that job is now kicking off. The workflow's kicking off. It's now doing the provisioning part. We can see in Tower we get the logs. That's no longer on the file system. All these logs are stored in the database. Tower is highly clusterable. It uses RabbitMQ underneath, and beneath that we've got celeryD. And so you can scale this out in odd numbers because of quorum requirements, but you can scale this out to as many as you need to cope with the sort of jobs that you've got. Sizing this stuff's quite tricky because your playbook may be doing provisioning and some deep configuration, maybe installation of WebSphere or something like that that's quite involved, or it could simply be changing a config file. So there's no substitute for doing load and scale testing yourself, but basically the profile that you need, we can pretty much accommodate anything. So that's running. I'm just going to go to my GitLab, and I'm going to go to my Ansible examples repository, and in picking off in particular a feature branch, which is where this playbook is living, Windows, WinAWS, and I'm going to just look at this from the point of one playbook. You see that okay at the back? The thumbs up if you can. Excellent. Okay. So there are two plays in this playbook. In the tower, when I was running it, I split that into two jobs within a workflow, but here I'm doing it all in one playbook. The first one is going to provision some stuff up here, and the second one a bit further down is just going to do something with those instances I've provisioned. So they're going off in the background. That's doing that at the moment, but I'll just walk you through this. So the first thing, because I'm talking to the Amazon API, this is a local host playbook because I'm just talking to the Amazon API, running it locally. There are no machines yet. They don't exist. The very first module I'm using, I haven't updated this. This has been deprecated. There's a new way of doing this, and I haven't changed it. But this is the slightly older way of doing it. It's still valid, but will be removed soon. What I'm doing is the EC2 AMI find. I'm using that module, and I'm looking for, doing a wildcard search for Windows 2012 server, 64-bit, and it's going to return me a list in descending order, and I'm going to register that as a variable in my playbook. So you see the emails just popped up, so those machines have been provisioned. So I'll just quickly look at my Amazon console. If I refresh that, those 5 machines are there, so they've been provisioned. It's now going to do the configuration. So we'll show you where we're at in the playbook. So I've got a list of my AMI IDs. I mean, how many times have you sat there trying to find out what the best AMI ID was for the image that you need? Here you can automate that all within the playbook. I'm then just going to pick off the first instance. Remember, it's in descending order to get the most recent AMI ID, and I'm going to set that as a fact in my playbook. Now that fact I'm going to use in the next module below, which is the EC2 module. So the EC2 module is the module responsible for provisioning. Here's the Win AMI ID that I've just found. Also, you'll notice here's the EC2 instance count. That was the variable that I asked Mario for the number, and Mario gave the number 5, and that populated this variable. So there's nothing magic going on here. The variables are variables, they're Ansible variables, and the tower is just an execution environment for that. The way that I'm using this module is I'm making sure that I have only exactly that number of instances with a particular tag, which is in my case demo filiere. And so if I run this, so there's 5 machines up there now, if I run this with 1, the number 1 in the EC2 instance count, it will shut 4 of them down. So that's just the way it's working. Don't have to have it work like that. But you can take variables within Tower that's based on the username that's logged into Tower, and so you can tag those machines that are created in the cloud based on the user that's actually provisioned them. So there's lots of power there around the actual sort of variables that you can use. You may be wondering to yourself, how do I enable this so that I can talk to it via WinRM with Ansible? And this is this user data concept we got here. So WinRM is installed by default on all Windows machines, but it's not enabled by default. So there's a little bit of PowerShell you need to run to get that enabled, and we do that here with this user data. So there's a little template in here that runs that PowerShell, and it also will take the local admin account and set up that local admin account on that machine. Again, Mario does not know what that password is. So we're using an Ansible Vault that has a password. I can assign that password to the cloud provisioning team, and Mario is able to run this playbook with all those secrets, but I'm able to keep them secret. Anyway, I then register the JSON object with all the information about those machines that we've just provisioned. And then what I do is I wait for the WinRM port to become available on those machines. So those 5 machines have come up. It's now waiting for them to come up and for the WinRM port to be enabled, and so that I can connect them with the next part of the play. And this bit, I don't need to do this in the workflow, but I do need to do it in the single playbook. I'm adding it to the internal inventory. In my workflow, I do the provisioning. I then synchronize the inventory, which we saw the email popped up. I then do the configuration. In here, I'm doing it all in one playbook. So I add the host to this web and production group, and then my next play targets that web and production group in order to configure those hosts. Again, it's using the vaulted secrets, so that's the local admin password. I'm just using a local admin account on those machines. Again, Mario doesn't know, can never know what that password is. And then all I'm doing is I'm using WinChocolatey to install some services on that Windows machine. In this case, Nginx and their service manager. And then I'm setting up the service, notifying that it needs to start Nginx. That's our event model that we have. And then I'm using the Win Firewall rule module to make sure that I can open up the port to Nginx. When I used to do this demo, I used to use the Win feature module to install IIS, and then I would bring up IIS up. But because I'm always using the latest Amazon image, it didn't always work, whereas I could be a bit more reliable with the Nginx. So let's see where we're at. So that's the provisioning successful. If we now look at the config, that's finished as well. So we can have a look, we can see the output. Again, all this is stored in the database, so if you've got a massive cluster of tower nodes, doesn't matter which one you connect to, you'll be able to see all of the data, all of the output. But I can just take one of these IPs, put it on my clipboard, open up a tab, and when we connect to it, remember these didn't exist before I got on stage, so now that's just got Nginx installed. There's no stretch of the imagination. I could install a whole bunch of other software. I could have orchestrated a deployment, put a load balancer in front, maybe set up a database, set up the schema, all those things that you would do in that environment management space. I can do all that from within the playbook. So I'm now going to move on to software development. So the little project that I've got here, in fact, what I'll do is I'll make a code change and kick that process off because it takes a little bit of time to run. And then we'll go and have a look at what's happening behind the scenes. So I'm now put my software development hat on. And what I'm going to do is make a code change, and then I'm going to show you how you may integrate Ansible into that software development process. So I'm going to say, hello, London. I'm going to make a change here, say hello, London, to my source code. And I'm going to change the image here. And I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to commit this into Git. So if I do hello, world, and then I push that up to my GitLab, that's made a change here. Hello, London, and a different image. It's going to deploy to a machine over here that's currently got nothing running on it. So this is a RHEL 7 machine. It's got absolutely nothing installed. There's no Java, no Tomcat. There's no technical accounts. The firewall rules are not set up. SE Linux policy, all those things you had to phone the Unix desk in order to get done are now all codified in the playbook. And I, as a developer, I have control over what goes in there. So I don't need to make that request. I write that in my playbook, and I check it in with my source code, like every other asset that I've got that's part of my source code. So let's quickly look at that. So I've got this Philly app application. This is a very simple web application. In fact, I used Maven. I used Maven Generate Archetype simple web application. Just creates a little Hello World JSP. And I've modified that a little bit. But notice here, I've added a folder called Plays. Now, this is just a convention I've introduced. And certainly, if I was still at the place I was at before, this financial services company, I would have made this available to all of my developers, of which there were 8,000, and we had about 3,000 applications. So I would have said, if you put your playbooks into this Plays folder alongside your source code repository, we will make that available via API in Tower. And so you will be able to close that little loop between the assets you've built and what you've deployed it to. So here, I've created this Plays folder, and in that Plays folder, I've taken a little tiny playbook. Here, I'm using some roles that maybe were written by another department. So maybe the security department wrote the SE Linux role. My middleware department wrote the Tomcat role. So I'm reusing that information from those two different departments. And then I'm just applying my specific tasks to deploy my application, which in this case are very crude. So it's just I'm just relying on the hot deploy of Tomcat. I'm just going to drop a WAR file in there, hope that it notices the change, and bring it up. But the important thing is all that Tomcat stuff is actually installing my middleware. It's installing the technical accounts. all those things you need to do to actually get your application to run. It's doing all that for me from the the role that my middleware department wrote. So here you can see I'm absolutely closing the gap between the platform that was provisioned for me, because I'm not doing provision in this particular use case, and there was used to be a gap between what I built and then what needed to be configured on the server before I could actually run it. I've now defined all of that in a playbook, so I've closed that gap entirely. And so I now have, in my source code repository, a complete description of how that application is deployed. And what's great about that is I can now push that through my release process, so I can go to release candidates, I can push it to staging, and I can actually cut a release of that. And I've not just tagged, and I'll show you this next, I've not just tagged my source code, I've then tagged my playbooks and my environment definition as well. So with the exception of any database schema changes, everything else is defined on a tag, it's immutable, I can roll it back, I can roll it forwards. So let's see how that's getting on. I've got Team City, which is it's actually built already a second ago, but I've basically got a deployment continuous integration build here that's got 2 steps defined in it. So if I show you what those steps are, the first one does a Maven clean deploy. So what that's going to do is it's going to assemble my WAR file and upload it into Artifactory. So this is standard sort of software development stuff, just building my artifacts and putting them into an artifact repository. The next thing I'm going to do is launch the job in Tower. So me as an application developer, my interface with Tower is just that plays folder. I don't need to log into the UI. The value I get is the REST API and the integration into my toolchain. So just by dropping a playbook into that plays folder, I've now sort of automated that pipeline all the way through to deploying my application. And so I'll just quickly show you. So I'm still logged in as Simon. If I take off the context root from my Tower server and I put API on the end here, you'll see I've got access to the Swagger documentation for all of the aspects of Tower's API. So I can click through, I'll just take V1, I can click through and all those things you saw in the UI, I've now got a hook into via the REST API. So if I wanted to create those surveys dynamically from some other system that I've got, where as new things become available, I can do that all via the REST API. So for instance, down here, I've got a survey spec. I can click on that. I can click on this little button, and it describes exactly how I could make that API call in order to control the objects that Ansible is running. So if I loop that back again, I've said this a couple of times now, Ansible is about automating things you're doing manually. Tower is providing that runtime environment for you to integrate into existing processes. Its power comes from this REST API. You're making your Ansible execution RESTful, which is just hugely powerful. So let's see where we're at. So that's that service that we had before that had nothing running on it. Now if I refresh it, we've got Hello London. That was a change I made. And we've got it, it's on a snapshot, and it's got a picture of the crowd. When I originally gave this talk, I attempted to take a picture of the crowd. This was my backup image. And believe it or not, and I should have realized this at the time, I was unable to airdrop it live on stage because the network was completely saturated. But anyway, so that's now in development. So in production, the last time I gave this demo was in 1985 at Live Aid. So that's my previous release. It's 108. What I want to show you next is how I would go through that release process so that I've got traceability for all the assets, not just the things that I've built and the source code that describes how it should be built. So again, I'm using Team City for that. So in Team City, again, it's like Jenkins or Bamboo. It just happens to be one I know how to use. I've got a bunch of release builds in here. So I'm just going to create another release build based off a template and provide it another tag. So I'm going to build this. You'll have whatever release management process you've got. The point of this is not about the tools I'm showing you. The point is I've got an existing software development process, and here's how I can integrate Ansible execution into that process. So here, I'm going to pick my template. I'm going to pick, it's got to be 109, and then I'm going to give it a 109 name. There you are, and I'm going to create that. So instead of the 2 steps I had before, I've now got 6, and again, I'm doing all this via, or most of this via the REST API. So the first thing I do is I set the version in my POM. So instead of building a snapshot, I'm now going to build an immutable release, okay? So if we look at my artifactory, and I look at my libs release local, which is where all my released artifacts are, once these are built, they shall never be changed. If you've got this far in your process and you've got a problem, it's a new release, okay? There'll be loads of stages before this, all the release candidates and that kind of stuff, but ultimately, what you've built is here forever. That's the idea. So here you can see I've got 106, 7, and 8. And what my TeamCity job will do is set the version in my POM so that when I do the clean deploy, it's going to build that immutable version 109 and put it into Artifactory. So that picture of the crowd and Hello London, that's going to be built into an artifact and put in my immutable artifact repository. I'm then going to SCM tag, so I'm going to tag my Git repo. Now remember, my Git repository not just has my source code in it, but it's also got my playbooks in it as well. So I'm not just tagging my source code, I'm tagging the description of how that software is actually pushed into production. And this could be an orchestrate deployment. Here it's just a single server, but Ansible, it's one of its real strengths is orchestration. So I can write in one playbook how to configure the load balancer, all the middleware tiers, and the database, and maybe the networking and everything, all in one playbook, and it will orchestrate all of that for me. So that's going to build tags. That's what I wanted to show you. Got a bit distracted. 3 minutes left. So in here, I've got Hello Live Aid. That was the last one that went into production, which is over here. And so when I run my job, the next thing it's going to do is create a project in Tower that is going to be aligned to that tag. And so it's going to take a job template to pull the playbook off that tagged version. And then it's going to grant permission to Bob. And Bob is in the release management group. Okay, so if I log in now as Bob, let me just go back to my Tower. I'm going to see now I've got 17 hosts. I can zoom that out a little bit. If I log in now as Bob, we can put Bob in a more simple view. And so what Bob can see are all the jobs he's ran before and the jobs he's allowed to run now. So he's got 106, 107, 108. The idea here is you'd probably keep a +1, -1 rolling window of jobs so that you always had the ability to roll whatever you had in production out again. And as soon as something became deprecated, you'd remove that from Tower. So Tower shouldn't become a repository of all information forever. It's just that runtime environment for your existing sort of operational state. So you see, we've got 108 here. So what I'm going to do is just quickly run this job. So I go back to my projects. I've created that project, 109. I'm just going to run that now. This should run through quite quickly because all it's doing is building the release artifact, tagging my repository, and setting up the objects in Tower. So we'll see how that goes. It's now running on the agent. I'm just going to click to the build log here so we can see how it's going. So it's set the version, it's built the release. So if I go to Artifactory and I refresh my releases, I should now see that I've got 109 that's just been built. And if I look and see how we're getting on, I've tagged the release in Git. So now if I refresh my tags, we've got 109 Hello World. So that's not just got my application code. I know I've said this a few times now, but it's got my playbooks as well. And then finally, if I look at my build, it's just finished. If I look at my Tower and I refresh that, that's new. It never used to do that. It's refresh the screen automatically. I used to have to refresh the screen. Now it's got the Affiliate Release 109. So we're a cautious company. We don't want those to be pushed to production without the appropriate approvals and without perhaps one set of eyeballs looking at it. So Bob wants the comfort of putting his password in to the production server. Only Bob has access to the secrets to the production server. Only Bob has access to the inventory of the production server. So me as a developer, I'm separated from that. I can't get onto production. A lot of people have that requirement. So here I'm asking Bob for his password. Hopefully I typed that right. This is telling me the couple of variables that I overrode. This is a release and it's a 109. I'm just going to launch this. Again, you probably picked up earlier, the way that Ansible works is a desired state configuration. So it only makes the changes it needs to get things into the state you've described in your playbook. If they are already in that state, it just reports back to you, everything's green, it's in the state that we expect it to be in. On my production server, obviously I already have Tomcat, already have Java, most of the security policies already applied, technical accounts are already there, so we should see a lot more green that goes through this. The thing's bleeping at me, I've got 20 odd minutes left. So hopefully it should run through a little bit quicker. So while it's doing that, just to explain, so it's going through, a lot of these things then are green because they're already in the state I expect them to be in. The important thing after that has run, and I will wait until we can see it in production. As I mentioned before, Bob, if there's a problem with that release, Bob can come back to a previous release. I've got it all on a tag. The binary artifact repository's got the actual immutable release. I've got the tag of the source code that was used to build it, that if you extend that into the rest of your tool chain, there may be JIRA tickets associated with that. That will be associated with user acceptance tests in your test management tool, right the way through to the requirements that were raised by the customer or the team. I'm able to roll this back. Again, as long as there's been no schema changes, that's an application level thing. Ansible can't solve that problem for you. That's responsibility of the application development team. And if you haven't realized there's a problem and you've let your users flood onto the system for a week maybe, it can't solve that problem for you either. That also is an application level problem. But everything else is now covered by this tag, absolutely everything else. So that's just finished. If I now go to my production server, we should see that we've got Hello London in version 109. As I mentioned, I could roll that back. I'm running over time, so I'm just going to stop there, and we'll flick over to the Q&A. If I can invite my colleagues up for the Q&A session, we'll field questions. We should have mic runners as well. So if you give us a second to set up. Thank you.